Now, where does let's shift totally and find out where philosophy begins at. There is what is kind of considered a pre-philosophical age, which is probably a misnomer because just because it's before, not just especially points to anything before the Greek schools of philosophy began as a pre-philosophical age, but doesn't mean that these things are less philosophies. In fact, some of them still have uh, areas of existence today. But your main ones that you came through in those times were the Hebrews, the Egyptians, the Chinese, the Hindus, and the Persians. Those are probably the most prevalent areas where thought had and increase in natural understanding and knowledge and its application came to be in these schools. And one way we see, and this is important as we get to why scholasticism is the true philosophy, and is um, that we see with them when they were developed over time, because they were problematic in various aspects. They actually degraded in their uh, in their usefulness and facilitation and closeness to truth. When we look at them, the perfect example of that is that all of those Hebrews, Chaldeans, Egyptians, Chinese, Hindus, and Persians all started off as monotheistic
Mm.
because man, when he utilizes reason and studies and deducts from the world around him, he's able to utilize reason alone to come to the conclusion that there can only be one God. Now, this is this whole entire study that is laid out in like St. Thomas and the Summa and everything that we're not going to dive into that, but by natural reason, man is able to conclude that God is singular. There can only be one ultimate supreme being, one creator of all things, one universal, all infinite being. By so all of them started off as monotheistic, and then it degraded from there. And then you ended up, well, you say, well, the Hebrews, they never believed in multiple gods, but they degraded to various forms of philosophy. You ended up having the Sadducees, who ended up being completely hedonistic, and that there was a god that created everything, but he has no influence over the world at all. And there's no punishment for bad, there's no reward for good. You just here on earth that God created and seeking after the greatest obtaining of pleasure that you can get. You had the Pharisees on the other end, who became essentially their own gods. They were this cult-like mentality that they and they alone are the interpreters of what God has revealed, and that nobody else can do so. And so, just you had to obey the Pharisees with absolute blindness to follow after them. It's corruption of the Hebrew philosophy. The Chaldeans and the Egyptians, both of them degraded into polytheism based on various aspects of the nature around them, and having various gods with various functions. The Chinese, they degraded into things of naturalism or spiritualism in ancestor worship and these aspects of it. The Hindus, they had the Brahmins, and which introduced both um, polytheism and pantheism into this same system. That there are multiple gods, and pantheism meaning that the stuff around us in the world is gods. That's why they worship cows. And you tell you if there's some levels of Hindus that take this to an extreme where you're not allowed to like kick a rock in the street because that's a god or that's part of God, and that's how they've degraded. And the Persians, they degraded down into into dualism and Gnosticism, and this, well, pre-Gnostics, but it was this dualistic idea that there was a good God and a bad God that were constantly warring, and this, there were the Zoroastrianists that ultimately was the people that the wise men came from. So that all was that those all began before um, before the Greek schools of philosophy, those ones, and they degraded down. And that's why anybody who tries to study like Eastern philosophies, like you get into Taoism or Hinduism, which is more philosophical than religious, or Buddhism, and which is certainly more philosophical than religious. You start to, if one of us from a Catholic background starts saying these things, your head hurts, because you're like, that doesn't even make sense. I don't understand how they could think these things are, because it's corrupted over time. When the Greeks started, they started with like these little schools of just sort of like cosmological type of aspects of it, like understanding certain aspects of life around them, and applying their better understanding of knowledge there. And these things too also really kind of corrupted. So like you had Pythagoras, as we mentioned before, but largely his aspect of application was the knowledge of mathematics and how that applied and could be seen in the world around. So it had facility, but it's a limited facility. The Eleatics, they had this. They ended up from the Greeks. They ended up coming into this understanding that the whole entire world is just change, and so therefore it essentially creates a school of skepticism, something that we'll get into later shows, that we can't know truth because the world's always changing around us. And so and then the same thing with the sophists. They were another school that that everything was based on man's experience, again creating relativism and skepticism, that it's that these things are changeable and mutatable. But it all came from they finally started to study the actual world around them, and their society was the first real society to support that study, where they set up schools, philosophical schools, and let these teachers, they would walk around and they would contemplate, and they would share the fruits of their contemplation on these things. And apparently, I don't know, probably didn't actually need to have a job somehow, but they were able to, which is kind of the way society again is sort of going, in this corruption of it, that we have these academics who never actually really live in the real world. That if you purely exist in the world of academia, then it causes a loss of touch with reality, because you're always dealing in the hypothetical and the theoretical and these things. And it's not to say that there isn't something that they can give, but it's to say that their scope is limited, because it lacks introspection to actual effects in the world, or what they do not always see what actually is substantive to mankind around them, and what's actually important. Which is why you have those nutty professors I remember having professors at college wondering, like, how they function in the world. They must have a wife that is just infinitely patient,
right.
because their shoes were untied, their tie would be twisted around backwards, their hair would be all unkempt, and they were smart, but they were really that kind of like, dude, how did you get here this morning? That type of thing.
So the next time I do that, I show up at in front of my wife, dressed like a ragamuffin, and my wife's mad at me. I'm just saying, sweetie, I'm a philosopher. What can I say?
Hey, you dove in the deep end with Father McKenna,
right?
Which
Exactly.
is what happens, So
yeah, my brain is so high up in thought right now. I can't put on a tie. Thanks,
right,
Father.
exactly.
Good
You're welcome. Good. Anything I can do to help you out. I don't think like those professors. You'll get them so far. So
This is true.
So
you can only try.
Which finally brings us to the real school of philosophy, the golden age of philosophy, as it was considered, which was the Greek school that we all sort of have a knowledge of, even if it sort of only is based in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventures or whatever movie it was when they met Socrates, as they called him. So I'm dating myself with that. That's early Keanu Reeves time, So that's pretty good. But yeah, that we have this school where we see a flow of progression from one teacher to another, Socrates to Plato to Aristotle. And those names now finally are familiar to us.
And Father, sorry, real quickly, about what time was this before Christ?
Approximately. That's a good question that I don't have off the top of my head. I would probably say fourth or third century BC.
That's what I was thinking too. Yeah.
I remember seeing recently when I was going through this, like Pythagoras, I think was sixth century BC. So it would have been after that. So I would say fourth, probably century BC, if I were to guess, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, you're right. At least that's for Socrates. It says around 4th century.
Mm-hmm. So, and that's it puts in perspective where these come from, because Plato was a student of Socrates and Aristotle was a student of Plato. So they actually studied underneath each other, one in subsequent fashion, and actually had different. We think of them as one school, but they actually differed in more ways than they were alike. For Plato, for Socrates, we don't really know anything firsthand. He left us no writings. Everything he did was oral teaching, and people would just sort of like follow him around as he sat underneath an olive tree and came up with like these great thoughts, and then they were, and then so it's from his students like Plato that we find any knowledge about Socrates actually. And so it's to be trusted, but only as far as secondhand knowledge can be trusted. It's always going to have bias and potential for abuse and everything that's in there. But essentially, Socrates, to get into some real basic concept of where he came from. Now, all three of these, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, were able to again use reason to come to the conclusion of a singular deity of a single God, which is important to show that, again, people who really seek after wisdom, this idea that we're not, that there is only one God, which is the foundation of anything apologetic coming down to proving Christianity and the Catholic Church and the Catholic faith, and then ultimately to what we do as traditional Catholics. It all starts there, that there is a God and that he is singular. And so that's something that's graspable for anybody who's willing to seek after knowing. Excuse me. And so Socrates, when the big aspect of the school, what it boiled down to is they finally separated themselves from the previous schools by striving to get into essentially what we know now as metaphysics. That is knowledge of entities itself, essences of something. And what I mean by that is it's not enough for me to be able to branch off in various other forms of reason. I need to understand why I know a tree is a tree. What makes a tree actually a tree. Metaphysics is a study of existence, the existence of physical things. So I have a physical existence, but moreover, the existence of ideas and ultimate truths that have existence. And so that falls into things like beauty, that there is objective beauty in the world. There is morals. There are just aspects of morality that are universal truths that are out there. And various other aspects to it. They are the ones that really started to get into this idea. For Socrates, his philosophy was based on this idea of innatism, that essentially we as man, we are born with a knowledge of all these truths in our head already. And because we have this knowledge, that my world experience is what brings them back, and that I am able to remember essentially these truths. So I know that Why do I know what a tree is when I see a tree out there? It's because I have this understanding already in my brain that lets me know what constitutes a tree. And so therefore, when I see one tree, an oak, and then I see a pine tree, I'm able to understand that they're both trees because I have an understanding of what tree is. And I'm just remembering, my world experience causes me to remember that. It's not a true understanding of human nature and ability to understand. It doesn't allow for any allowance really of rationality of man, because everything is this preconceived understanding, and it doesn't explain for, like, defect in rationality as well.
Right.
Um, it also it also has this creates an egotism that is a constant inward reflection. I got to know myself better. I have to have a greater knowledge of me. I got to know the things like, if I'm constantly inwardly reflected. So it has that as its basis. And what it does have is some aspect of touching on this explanation of truth that does have some validity to it. For instance, that he knew that the body was the man was composite body and soul, and that this he believed that this innate knowledge was a function of the soul. And so that he knew that there were these two pieces to what composed man. He also knew it also explains some aspect of our knowledge, that while all there's so many aspects that we can say, like, I don't know what tree is until I'm introduced to it. At the same time, I do have, like, as we said, these basic components of the Ten Commandments ingrained, that I don't need to be instructed on killing somebody is wrong. I don't need to be instructed in stealing being morally wrong. I have that natural inclination because there is a little bit of truth to innate knowledge. Adam had innate knowledge of all things because that was a gratuitous gift of God. We have innate knowledge of what's necessary for basic moral operation in the Ten Commandments ingrained in our hearts. But it's not this sufficient enough to say all things, like this innate understanding that Socrates had. That morphed into Plato. Excuse me. Plato had a different idea. He too understood that the body and the soul were separate, but he believed, instead of that we were just ingrained with thought, that the soul pre-existed the body. And so your body was made later on, but before you ever came to be born, there was this world of you existed spiritually only, in sort of like this spiritual world. And in that world, for a lack of better terminology, we'll call it, that world was the world of universals. And so in that world, your soul experienced what the universal tree is, or a universal dog, or a universal car, or a universal house. And what we mean by that, to break that down for our listeners, what a universal is the essence of a thing. So when we look at something and we can see that they appear differently, I mean, look, you're looking at your screen now. You see me, Father McKenna, and you see Kevin Davis on the other side. You understand that we are both men, because there's this essence of man that is greater than the physical differences that there are between us. And so you understand, we have this ability to understand what the essence of a thing is. Just like I said before about the pine tree to the maple tree to the spruce tree to the dogwood tree, we are able to understand that they are all trees because we understand what the essence of a tree is. Plato's desire was to explain how, and this is why, as well as Socrates, and eventually we'll come to Aristotle, his desire was to in understand in trying to explain that is that that his belief was that our souls existed in this world of universals, and so we knew the universals from there. And then when we come and see the individual objects in this life that are distinct and different and all of these things, that we're able to not remember what tree was because we know what it is, but because we've experienced what quote unquote universal tree, all tree is, the essence of tree is in from our previous existence before our soul joined up with our body. Um, Now, it does seem a bit strange, obviously, for us to kind of go into that realm, but we do it did come into play and became very kind of popular in its belief, and then later on became something that even intermingled with Christianity. There were times where Platonic philosophy was more prevalent than Aristotelian philosophy, um, and that was largely due to an inability to get many much good translations of Aristotle. I'll touch about that in a moment, because that brings us to ultimately um, Aristotle. So for Plato, lastly, it denies this man's ability to abstract, but it does affirm that there are universal and unchangeable truths. So we've moved on from just a simple knowledge of what tree is, which was what Socrates said, to that there is this thing that is more substantial than just having experienced trees or knowing trees, that there is a universal idea of a tree that actually exists. So Plato does move on and advance to that point of affirming that, and then it is Aristotle who takes the knowledge of his predecessors and then takes his own reflection and his own rationality and builds upon it and creates um, Aristotelian philosophy. And his point is that basically is based in that man's mind has three main functions. That it is to know things. This is Aristotle, sorry, by the way. So it's to know things, that is abstraction, that we are able to grasp by observing around us the essence of things. By seeing trees, we are able to understand that there is something that is an essence of that binds it together. It is We understand what tree is because we have observed trees and been able to pull from that experience what the essence of that is by the power of our mind. That is one of the faculties of our mind. Number two, our mind is then able to compare those findings and make judgments upon them. That is to say that it's able to compare one tree to another, or something to broccoli, to say that that's not quite tree, but like it has, even though it has a similar look to tree, and and it's able to make judgments moving forward, so that we are able to take that um and say, okay, like I can make a judgment on whether or not this experience is like this tree. And third is to work out further judgments, to be able to, based on my previous experiences and findings and conceptions of my mind, I'm able to then in come to conclusions that of things that maybe I even haven't experienced yet, based on what I've found. This is, by definition, reasoning. That's the key. Aristotle has worked out how actually our minds work, and how we are able to reason, how we are able to use logic. This whole process, all three of those functions, to know a thing, to compare and judge a thing, and to work out future and further judgments, that is logic. So when I say that the basic of basic syllogisms for logic, A is B, B is C, therefore A is C. It's because I'm able to know that because I've experienced A and B being equal. I've experienced B and C being equal. I haven't experienced C and A next to each other, but I, by my own ability to reason, to use logic, am able to conclude without having seen them side by side and compared them in actuality that they are the same. That's the use of logic in our lives. Aristotle develops this. He develops it into the two groups of it. One is to be known as deduction. That is, that we take general knowledge and general truths and accepted truths, and we're able to from them work towards specific um, realities. So um, you know that man is a rational being, and therefore and as long as a man is has healthy brain function and things like that, that we accept these general principles, man being rational. Then I come across you, Kevin, and I see that you are a man. I can, as long as you are healthy in your mental capacity and functionability, I am able to know that you therefore have the use of reason because you are a man. And so I've moved from the general of man being rational towards Kevin having rationality. The other is induction, and it's the reverse of that. It's to work from the the specific examples to a greater understanding. This is important because this is, by definition, what we call the scientific method today. So deduction is what we use for sort of like rational conclusion coming from general principles. That's our logic in a lot of times for applying principles to life. This is what we sort of have in the way of experimentation. That if I want to understand something, if I want to find a greater truth that I don't know, I can compare specific examples. And if I get a large enough sampling of those things, I can infer or induct truths from them. So, you know, again, if I, if you're, it's any scientific experiment, if it's done properly, we seem to, as a science and medical industry and everything, gotten away from the use of the scientific method. But what do? You make sure you have multiple times and multiple variable, control the variables, do all these things so you can make conclusions based on your repetitive findings, and so that's called induction. Again, kind of not trying not to get too far into the weeds and keep that as simple as possible. But these distinctions are very important in understanding Aristotelian philosophy. Another aspect of Aristotelian philosophy was he developed this study of physics, or at least greatly, maybe not discovered, but greatly focused on the idea of physics. Not modern, not to be confused with the scientific or experimental physics that we think of when you take a physics class in school. That's not what we're talking about. But his philosophical understanding of physics is this understanding of cause and change and movement in the world around us, and the study and understanding of that. This is important because it has the very basis of so many aspects of what we witness around us. So, for instance, take man as a whole. In the study of physics with Aristotle, we can look at man's birth, his growth during life, and his death, and understanding that entirety of existence, understanding the difference between accidentals and substantials. So, for the listeners, an accidental change is something that does not change the nature of the thing that exists. If I have ice cream and I add Oreo cookies to it, I've made Oreo ice cream. but it's still ice cream. If I have ice cream and then I present to you frozen yogurt or sorbet or something like that, I've completely removed ice cream from the equation. And so the change in presentation that I've given you is a substantial. There's no more ice cream at all to be spoken of there. Water, if it boils and turns into steam, it's still water. It's just accidentally changed. When a child draws on the wall, that's an accidental change to the wall. It's not, but if I were to tear down the wall, take the debris, and then turn it into um, a lawn sculpture, that's no longer a wall anymore. I've made a substantial change to that. That's the difference between it. So in man's existence, as our example of that study in a more complete aspect of knowing change and cause and movement, we see the essence, the idea of what is the cause of man's existence to come in when it comes to birth. God is the creator of man as part of that causality. Then also the natural causality of where they came from their parents, then and all of that, and that life is infused at conception. Those all come from that first part of man's life. Then we see in that, and those are substantial things, that when life begins and man becomes man as such at that moment of conception, that is a substantial change. You've gone from the non-existence to existence. You've gone from two separate sources of DNA to one combined individual source of DNA. There's you've gone from matter and potentiality to combination of soul and body. That's a substantial change. Then you see the person's growth throughout their life. These are accidental changes. They get taller, they get heavier, they gain muscle mass, they grow hair, they are able to speak, they grow, their hair turns gray, falls out, they get wrinkly, they get smaller again, and then that's their life progression. Those are accidental changes. That person is still the same person, but they are changing throughout that time frame, and then at the end of it they die. And that's an important distinction, especially back then. It's important for us now too, because what constitutes death? Because there's clearly something left behind. You still have a body that is there, but we know that that's no longer the person who they are. That's that corpse there is no longer Johnny. That corpse is just a corpse. That is the earthly remains of Johnny, because the substantial change at the end of life is is that um, is that separation of soul and body again. That's what we understand it as Christians to be, and I believe even Aristotle understood it in his understanding of physics to be. But it's for the person who does not follow Aristotelian logic or Catholic thinking or whatever. It is much more difficult for them to define death when death is, and that line or life, when that line becomes much more arbitrary. Look at, many of our listeners are pro-life movement type people. They can see it in their own reality. Once you get away from the substantial joining of body and soul together at conception, that moment of conception, life becomes arbitrary as to its beginning. Does it begin when brain waves start to happen? Does it begin when they are able to survive outside of the womb? Does it begin when natural birth begins? Does it begin when they gain the use of reason, as the eugenicists want to talk about? You have this entire, sort of spectrum of development that takes place, that we begin to no longer able to have that concrete point, because we've gotten away from what the absolute truth is there, and this understanding of, in the study of physics, of the joining of body and soul together. Same thing on the other end. If you get away from the separation of body and soul as the demarker of death, is death then when the heart stops? Is it, but you bring people back from that? Is it when the brain stops functioning? But we've had people, regain brain function before. How is it when, what is your Is it, or is it as the Darwinian evolutionists and eugenicists want to say, that when you no longer are beneficial to society and to humanity, like that's like like where does that that life end if it's not separation of body and soul? And so that's an important distinction, that's Aristotelian in his physics. uh, he is the father of, or he is the one that really develops this real understanding of metaphysics, that's non-material, real existence. So again, when we talked about metaphysics in terms of the universals, that's part of it. Also, the separation of potential and actual is part of the understanding that comes from Aristotle, that that there are things that have essence, meaning real existence, that are pure potentiality. So that never have physical. So think of a unicorn. You can actually understand what a unicorn is, but you cannot. But unicorns do not have physical existence. So there's a metaphysical idea of a unicorn, but there is no actual physical existence of a unicorn. If you think of a blue dog, there's never been, as far as man has ever known, created a blue dog in nature. But you understand the concept of blue and you understand the concept of dog, and you can combine the two together to paint in your head a picture of a blue dog.
Mhm.
That's the separation of universals and specifics, and also potentials and um and in actuality, these things that are there, that comes from the metaphysics of of Aristotle, as well as that the metaphysics in understanding our relationship in the creation of the universe, that God, there can only be one like primary cause, that is the supreme being, that is the eternal being, that's God, and that's why he's singular. That comes from Aristotle's metaphysics. And that we are secondary causes, that we subsequently come from the primary cause, and that we are made for an actual end or purpose in life. This is all developmental aspects of metaphysics. And I think probably as we're coming here, our listeners probably are starting to realize, like, these are all things that we regularly talk about as Catholics, that are being laid out by someone who existed before Christ in a non Israelite society. That, like, this is a man completely devoid from divine inspiration, who's laying these foundations out. He also had the a study of ethics. Again, ethics is not unique to Aristotle, but he's the one that first finally comes to understand that in these universal principles and existence, there's also exists things that are truly right and truly wrong, and that these things are unchangeable in their, whether something is right or wrong. There are principles that apply to right and wrong action that we should, as a society, be able to adhere to all the time. And now and he breaks it down to sort of like ends and means as to being able to determine those things. And so, like, your ends are your goal that you're seeking after, and that goal could be either good, bad, or indifferent. And if it's good, then it can be a personal goal or a societal goal, like whose good is it aimed towards, and those things. And then the means is like how you procure that end, that he breaks it down into. It's a good breakdown, but it's an imperfect one. It's part of the reason why, like, he in his own writings justifies, slavery, for instance, because his ethics aren't perfect, but it is the real, like, primary attempt at really fundamentally explaining, in a good way, how we have ethical conclusions and how we're able to operate as good people versus bad people. That there are these universal truths and principles that apply, and that ultimately brings us to the church finally, and this I knew that the first show would be the long show, so I apologize to our listeners in advance. We are at the end. I promise this is the last little bit, and we'll be done, and it'll set us up perfectly to go on. The Catholic Church has its own philosophy. It is adopted, or mode of philosophy, I should say, school of philosophy, however you want to put it. It's an adopted philosophy. So it is taken imperfect philosophies and Christianize them. The best illustration of that is that when I hear about the order of perfection in philosophical thought, that somebody once told me that Aristotle is the example of the greatest mind per se, unaided by God's grace, and Saint Thomas Aquinas is the greatest mind ever created by God and aided by supernatural grace.
Mm-hmm.
And so the same with the schools. We have these Greek schools, which themselves are not perfect, but we show that they progress in development and have laid the foundation and framework to grow off of. We then come to the time of Christ and his establishment of the church, and that potentiality of having supernatural grace assist these things. And from there, where is the church going to draw its foundation for reasoning and ability to make arguments and to support itself and its theology? It comes from the Greeks. Now, I say it comes from the Greeks as a general term because bits and pieces have been taken from various people over the years to take that, but also in time, not one was constantly used from beginning to end. We had in the early church the understanding of Greek and philosophers, and reading the classics. Saint Jerome got in trouble for that by when our Lord came and said, you're more of a what did he say? He said to Saint Jerome, you're more of a I can't think of the author that he loved reading now, but he's like, but you're more into the classics than you are into as a Christian, and so he got into a little bit of trouble in that way with our Lord, but and then eventually that turned, but a certain period of time, largely the influence of Aristotle actually in the early church, that he was there amongst this ability to use, but then he largely fell away, and that was a product of two things. One is that finding good translations was difficult, and those who had translations were actually the Arabs, and the second part to that is that those Arabs, in utilizing Aristotle, had both mistranslated at times and misappropriated how to apply the principles and the schooling of Aristotle there. And so it created like this sort of fear amongst like that was the Muslim school, was the Aristotelian school, and the Christian school remains more ancient and be with that which had been established a little bit more clearly in the Christian world, which was the Platonic school that came more from Plato. Later on, with Saint Albert the Great and Saint Thomas Aquinas, they re-Christianized really Aristotelian philosophy, and that became known as Scholasticism. And that became the church's truly approved mode of philosophy and school of thought that it uses. But that we still see remnants of Platonism in the world around us, because that facility of using Aristotle came with Saint Albert the Great and Saint Thomas Aquinas. It meant it came post-schism. And so when you start talking with and diving into the thought process and understanding of Eastern Orthodox mindset, we see that it's actually very quite Platonic in its thought process, and we see that in the fact that they have much less focused on rationality and distinctions in what they do. While they understand there's concept of greater sin and lesser sins and stuff like that, they don't break it down like we do in the West, where there's mortal sin and there's venial sin. You know, it's more of a this focus on, well, it's an offense against God. It's sort of, you know, they they don't go full Protestant where it's just all sins are equal, they're bad, and you don't do them. But so they still have this understanding greater and lesser, but it's not really focused on as to, how, do I need to go to confession or should I go to confession, or like, or that type of thing. And you know it's also much more based on like mysticism, mystical experiences, personal experiences, um the disposition of the heart of the person, that's, that they, and it serves to rationalize why all their their nationalistic churches exist and have differences amongst them, that they're still view themselves as the church of that our Lord set up, because, well, it's more about the heart longing to serve and love God than it is about, one little distinction or another. And a lot of that is those problematic aspects of it base in Platonism. That is, now that's not to say that those things are unimportant. It is important, the disposition of our heart, that we do have a love for God. And it is to understand, we are to understand that even small sins are offenses against God and we should avoid them. But the fact that they are less inclined to make those distinctions, it's also the same reason why you're less likely to actually be able to have good productive arguments with orthodox people, because eventually you kind of get to a point where they're like, they don't really have the real solid explanations to argue with you, but they're also not convinced because it's not as important any longer as we've come to be utilizing Aristotle under the scholastic method. And when you have the Aristotelian method, then you see that it truly is a method that bases itself in rationality. Anybody who's ever picked up the Summa to even just look at it, whether or not you've read it or not, knows this by seeing the way St. Thomas Aquinas you reasons out or defends the aspects of the faith. It's all, how does he do it? He takes the problem or the question, right? And he puts that first. And then after that, it comes, what are the objections to it? He thinks of every possible objection to this, to this, this proposed idea that he can think of. And then he provides the proofs after that, where he goes one by one after each of the objections to disprove those objections as being faulty. And so that in the end, you are only left with the conclusion as and the truth being the only possible explanation or answer to the question proposed at the beginning. That's the scholastic method. That's devolved from Aristotelian philosophy. That's the church's philosophy. And having that basic understanding now, this allows us to springboard going forward into when we bring up next time, one specific modern philosopher who's, erroneous. We can now have a baseline to compare and contrast as to, oh, that's, now I can see why that's problematic. But until, that's why, like I said, the long show is, it's there for a reason. It's to set the foundation. I hope people bore with us. I hope it wasn't too boring. But that foundation now being laid, it allows us to go, into these various other things and more clearly and easily see why they're problematic.
No, it was great, Father. It was really, really fascinating. So much information. My head is kind of overflowing, but it may be something people may have to watch a couple times. But not too much into the weeds. Just a lot to go through, and it really well done, Father. I really appreciate it. And I guess one last question I'd have for you. Excuse me. If someone after watching this, they're really interested now, and okay, this sounds like something I want to learn more about. And of course, we're going to have a series covering the errors of modern philosophy. What would be a way for someone to I know this is a hard question because it's too general, but would you recommend somebody to go and read Aristotle or to read St. Thomas Aquinas if they're interested in if someone wants to get into philosophy, where should they start?
I think if they were to start, I would actually start with um, something along the lines of, um, I would actually start with I think it's the only one of his series that's reprinted, because the other books are hard to get hands on. I'm still trying to complete the entire series that he has in books. I used to own them. I no longer do. I have all of his books, so now I'm trying to rebuild that section. But um, Monsignor Paul Glenn, come over, he had a great introduction to philosophy book, as well as a history of philosophy book. Those are two different books that he wrote that technically are, can be included in with his various studies. And that's the thing, like, from those two things he then gets off into, the different, it ends up being actually like a textbook series for the philosophy student, because the next thing is like dialectics and cosmology, and gets into like the various different aspects of philosophy to teach it. But the introduction to philosophy, as well as the history of philosophy from Monsignor Glenn, as one of those authors, those are good sources where you could probably pick it up, and it'll give you, like I said, the introduction of philosophy. It'll give you the the basic ideas of these different studies. You can get into the various different. Once you get past, it gives you a bit of a history where it comes from. His introduction then goes into different areas of philosophical study and what they are in a general sense. And so that would be like, without having somebody to kind of guide you along the way, that'd be a good jump off point, would be there, before you ever actually picked up stuff with Aristotle, or picked up stuff with Thomas Aquinas and things like that. And um, you know um, yeah, that would be a good starting point. After that, I would say that, you know, yeah, getting into, I think, taking, yeah, I don't think if a person really, really wants to study philosophy, then they're going to have to really invest some time into like really studying different aspects of philosophy, and then you are going to have to get into the weeds. Then you are going to, Father Valancourt used to say to me when we'd have some like difficult philosophy classes coming, like, oh, today's a 2 cup of coffee day, Steve, like, so go get yourself another cup. And um, so you do get into a much more in-depth study that way. But if somebody who's wanting to learn a bit more and get some things like that, that would be a good starting point. And then I think even going from there, instead of getting into the Summa or something like that, I think that too is probably too far down the line. You can, I might have even been Glenn. Don't quote me on this, but I do remember there was like a Summa to the Summa that was written, and it might have even been Glenn that did that, where he made it much more condensed and and simplistic, or just getting into studying apologetics. It'd be much more applicable if our philosophy is applied understanding. It's a real wisdom. Then pick up an apologetics book on the faith, because now you've taken that basis of understanding, and you're able to apply it to something that is really practical for the common person, which is, how do I defend my faith and the questions about the faith to people who ask them, that you run into on the street. And I think that's for your general people, that's where you really want to put your focus into, study of the catechism, study of apologetics. Then you get into really that Catholic action, that Pius XII, I believe, was real proponent of, and where lay people are working to try to influence and do good for souls and gain more people converts and things like that, and to apply that to their daily lives as well, towards thinking outside of just what is the narrative that's fed to us. So So that would
Awesome.
be, yeah. I think once you start getting to, you can always go higher and deeper, and then you start really getting into where you end up being in philosophy classes, and that's a much harder thing to put a stamp on where to go, what to do. But if you, for the average everyday person, as to something that can be both beneficial to their increase in knowledge of philosophy and then their application to usefulness in life. That would be the way I would go. A good intro, and then a good apologetics book or something like that.
Awesome. Thank you, Father. Boy, I really appreciate it. That was quite the show. I'm really looking forward to the upcoming ones. I hope people appreciate it, and I hope people stick with us. We don't really know exactly how often we'll be doing it. Father's a busy guy, of course, so hard to do the necessary research and study that he needs and to come on the show. But whenever you come on, Father, we always love it. We always appreciate you. And I wanted to say too that when we record this, it's recently after your birthday and your the anniversary of your ordination. So happy birthday! Congratulations on your ordination, and everyone, please, who's watching this, say an extra prayer for Father, not just because he's kind enough to come on the show, but because of his recent events to celebrate.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Yes. So no, it was a fantastic show, and like I said, hopefully people stuck with us on this one. This is the long show. I promise that subsequent shows will be more focused and more easily digestible and shorter in time.
I can say for sure I enjoyed it. If anyone else enjoyed the show, please like, share, subscribe, comment. I'd love to hear what everyone thought about it. What do you take from this? Kind of brief. I mean, it's considering what the topic. Considering you just kind of summarized philosophy and Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. An hour and a half. That's pretty good, Father. I think you could have done worse. It could have been 2 days talking about this topic. I think you did quite well. And until next time, Father, God bless you.
Oh,